The sound of his mother's fork clinking delicately against her porcelain plate was the only noise in the vast dining room. It was a sound of perfect etiquette, and it underlined the heavy silence that had followed my answer. I had just told them, with a carefully practiced, shy smile, that my parents were simple people and that I worked a modest job. I watched as Mrs. Thorne's eyes, a cool, assessing blue, swept over my thrift store cardigan. She didn't say a word. She just took a slow sip of water, her gaze lingering on the faint, repaired stitch on the cuff. In that moment, a cold clarity washed over me. This was a test, and I had just walked into it wearing the perfect disguise. My story with Leo began in the rain. It was one of those afternoons where the sky opens up without warning, turning the city into a blur of wet pavement and hurried figures. I was sheltering in the doorway of a small, independent bookstore, clutching a bag of new art supplies to my chest. He was next to me, laughing as he shook water from his dark hair. "It's like the sky just gave up on the day," he said, and his smile was so genuine, so unguarded, that I laughed too. We ended up browsing together, then sharing a pot of tea at the cramped cafe next door. He told me he was an architectural historian, fascinated by how space's shape lives. I told him I was a graphic designer, obsessed with how visuals tell stories. For 3 hours, the rain pattering against the window, we talked about everything and nothing. There was no performance. It was just two people, connecting. That was the Leo the First fell in love with. The man who preferred dusty archives to downtown clubs, who could name every tree in the park, who read poetry not to seem clever, but because he genuinely loved the way words could make him feel. He lived in a small, book-filled apartment that smelled of coffee and old paper. He drove a sensible, slightly dented car. He spoke of his family with a warm, if slightly distant, affection. "They're good people," he'd say. "A bit set in their ways. My father's in finance. My mother, well, she runs their social world." He said comfortable when describing their means. I imagined a nice suburban home, perhaps a country club membership. I never imagined the gated estate, the silent staff, the art that I recognized from gallery previews. My own upbringing was rooted in a different kind of substance. My parents, Eleanor and Robert Vance, were forces of nature. They met in college, two ambitious students with nothing but ideas and energy. My father saw a problem with a specific type of industrial valve and spent 5 years in our garage, failing and tinkering and failing again, until he perfected it. That valve became the foundation of Vance Precision Manufacturing. My mother, with her artist's eye and steel trap mind, built her interior design firm not by decorating mansions for the elite, but by reimagining public spaces, libraries, community centers, hospitals, arguing that beauty and function were human rights. Money came, yes, but it was never the point. The point was the work, the creation, the integrity. They raised me with that ethos. I attended excellent schools, traveled widely, and wanted for nothing material. But the constant refrain was, "Your name is not a credit line, Maya. It's a promise to be honest, to work hard, and to leave things better than you found them." I watched my mother gently but firmly turn down clients whose values didn't align with hers. I saw my father refuse to cut corners, even when it cost him a lucrative contract. Their pride was in their craft, not their bank balance. This is why, when my relationship with Leo deepened, a subtle anxiety began to gnaw at me. He started mentioning, almost apologetically, the annual family gala at the museum, the summer gatherings at their compound on the coast, his mother's notions about suitable careers for the women in the family. "She'll love you," he'd say, but his eyes held a flicker of something else, apprehension. "She just appreciates a certain pedigree." The word pedigree hung in the air. It spoke of bloodlines and breeding, of a world where who you were born to mattered more than who you chose to become. I loved Leo deeply, but I began to fear that the family he came from might only see the surface, the Vance fortune, the social connections my parents' success afforded. They wouldn't see the garage, the sleepless nights, the principled stands. They would see an asset, a merger. So, the idea was born from a place of both self-protection and romantic idealism. What if they met just Maya? Not Maya Vance, heiress to a minor industrial empire and a renowned design legacy. Just Maya, the graphic designer, the girl from a modest, hard-working family. I proposed it to Leo one night as a kind of game, a test of true belonging. If they love me when they think I'm just me, I said, won't that be the purest proof? He hesitated, his brow furrowed. It feels like a lie, he said softly. It's not a lie, I insisted, convincing myself as much as him. It's just not leading with the paperwork. I want them to know my heart first. He finally agreed, reluctantly. I saw it as taking control of the narrative. I didn't yet see that I was handing them the pen to write a far worse one. The day of the dinner arrived with a crisp, autumnal chill. I deliberately chose an outfit that was clean, neat, but unmistakably ordinary, a soft gray cardigan I'd actually found in a vintage store, a simple black skirt, pearl studs that could have been real or fake. I twisted my hair into a simple bun. In the mirror, I looked pleasant, unassuming, and utterly unlike myself. A nervous flutter settled in my stomach. Leo picked me up from my downtown studio apartment, a cozy, rented space I used for painting, which I'd staged to look like my primary residence. The drive to his parents' home was quiet. Just be yourself, he said again, as the city gave way to sweeping, tree-lined avenues and finally, to the imposing iron gates of the Thorne estate. The house that loomed ahead was not a home, it was an institution. Georgian architecture, flawlessly maintained, with a symmetry that felt forbidding. A silent housekeeper let us in. The foyer was a marble cavern, our footsteps echoing. The air smelled of lemon polish and old money. Mr. and Mrs. Thorne awaited us in the drawing room. Charles Thorne was a tall, austere man with silver hair and a handshake that was more a brief, dry compression of fingers than a greeting. Vivian Thorne was a masterpiece of calculated elegance. Her blonde hair was perfectly swept, her knit dress the color of cream, her smile as precise as a surgical incision. "So, you're the Maya we've heard so much about," she said, her voice melodic yet cool. Her eyes performed a swift, comprehensive scan, from my shoes to my hairline. I felt priced. Dinner was served in a dining room that could seat 30. The four of us were clustered at one end, making the vast space feel even more isolating. The first course was a soup so delicate it seemed to evaporate on the tongue. The questions began with the salad. "And your family, Maya?" Mr. Thorne intoned, not looking up from his plate. "What do they do?" This was my moment. I took a small breath. "My father runs a small technical workshop," I said, keeping my voice light. "He's very hands-on. And my mother has a great eye for design. She helps with interiors sometimes." It was true, in the most reductively minimalist way possible. "A tradesman and a decorator," Vivian said, with a nod that implied she'd just filed me in a specific cabinet. "How honest." She turned her focus to me. "And you're a graphic designer. How fascinating. Is that a stable field?" I explained my work, deliberately downplaying the scale and prestige of my clients. I spoke of small businesses and local projects. With every humble detail I offered, Vivian's demeanor thawed by a fraction of a degree. But it wasn't warmth. It was a sense of management. She was categorizing me as a project within her sphere of influence. Then came the moment that changed the air in the room. As the main course was cleared, Vivian leaned forward slightly, her expression one of benevolent concern. "You know, Maya," she began, "it's so refreshing to meet a young woman with her feet on the ground. So many girls in our cycle," she said, with a dismissive wave of her hand, "they have this air of entitlement, as if the world owes them everything because of who their grandfather was. It's vulgar." She paused, letting her words hang. Leo shifted in his seat. I remained still. "But you," she continued, her gaze settling on me with a patronizing intensity. "You understand the value of things, don't you? You understand that respect is earned through hard work, not given as a birthright. That's a quality we admire greatly." The condescension was so profound, so beautifully wrapped in the language of praise, that it stole the air from my lungs. She was applauding me for the very struggle she believed defined me. She was celebrating the limits she assumed were my ceiling. And in doing so, she was drawing a bright, unyielding line between our circle, the entitled, and people like me, the earners. I was to be the testament to their own broad-mindedness, their living proof that they valued character, as long as that character knew its place. I looked at Leo. His eyes were on his empty dessert plate. He said nothing. He didn't squeeze my hand. He didn't offer a counter. He absorbed his mother's words in a silence that felt like complicity. The betrayal was not in her cruel kindness. It was in his quiet acceptance of it. The facade, once built, became a prison. Leo's family took me under their wing with a suffocating grip. They began to plan our future, their version of it. Mrs. Thorne took me to lunch at a sensible cafe. Over a modest salad, she slid a brochure for a community college across the table. "A little business certificate, dear," she said, "so you can better support Leo's career. We'll pay, of course." I felt the brochure's cheap paper under my fingers, a physical symbol of the small, boxed-in life they were designing for me. The invitations changed. Instead of family galas or theater nights, I was invited to help at their charity thrift shop sorting donations. Mrs. Thorne would introduce me to her friends. "This is Leo's lovely girl. She's so practical." The word was a code, and everyone understood it. The worst pressure came through Leo. He started adopting their language. "Maybe Mum has a point about the course," he'd say one night, massaging his temples. "It would take pressure off us later." Or, "Dad knows a guy who could get you a steadier office job. The design thing is a bit unpredictable, isn't it?" He was being molded back into the son they expected, and the version of me he presented was the key. Our arguments were quiet, tense things. "I thought you loved me for me," I'd say. "I do," he'd insist. "But we have to be realistic about our future." The loneliness was profound. I couldn't call my parents and explain the mess I'd made. I'd see my beautiful, powerful mother on a video call and want to cry, listening to her talk about a new project, while I was being tutored on how to clip coupons by Mrs. Thorne. My real life, my successful business, my intellectual property, my investments, felt like a secret, shameful fantasy. I was cornered by my own deception, watching the man I loved slowly agree that the impoverished, limited woman I was pretending to be was all I could ever be. The reveal came not with a bang, but with a guest list. Mrs. Thorne was planning a large garden party, a showcase event. She handed me a stack of elegant envelopes to address. "Just the inner cycle," she said breezily. As I wrote names I recognized from society pages, one line item on the attached planning sheet caught my eye. Under catering headcount, family and essential staff, my name was listed. And next to it, in parentheses, +1 optional, if her parents can make the trip. Advise they may be more comfortable with the staff buffet. I stared at the paper. The cold, administrative cruelty of it took my breath away. They weren't just looking down on me, they were preparing to segregate my own parents, to relegate them to a separate, lesser space based on a fiction I had created. This wasn't just snobbery. It was a profound, dehumanizing disrespect. In that moment, the power balance shattered and reassembled. The shame I felt transformed. It was no longer shame for my fictional poverty, but a burning shame for what I had allowed. I had handed them a brush and let them paint my wonderful, hard-working parents as people who belonged with the staff. I had given them the power to make my real life into a charity case. The trap wasn't theirs. It was mine, and I finally had the key. I didn't confront Leo. I didn't cry. I went home, poured a glass of wine in my beautifully appointed condo, a fact Leo never knew, as he'd only ever picked me up from my quirky downtown studio apartment, and I made a plan. It was time to end the experiment. But the revelation would not be an emotional scene. It would be a simple presentation of fact. My countermove was dignity, delivered in 3 parts. First, I called my parents. I told them the whole, humiliating truth. My mother was silent for a long moment. Then she said, "Oh, my brave, foolish girl. What do you need?" Their support was my bedrock. Second, I chose the battlefield. It would not be a private, dismissible argument. It would be at their prized garden party, in front of their inner circle. I would not cause a scene. I would simply arrive as myself. Third, I prepared my evidence, not as weapons, but as unassailable truths. I gathered none of it to flaunt. I gathered it to quietly correct a false premise. I selected a simple but exquisitely cut dress from a designer my mother often collaborated with. I arranged for a car, not a flashy one, but the reliable, high-end service my family used. I prepared no speech. My plan was simply to be present, in my full truth, and let the dissonance speak for itself. The most strategic step was telling Leo nothing. He had chosen his side in the silence. Now he would witness the consequence of that choice. The day of the garden party arrived. I told Leo the first had a client meeting and would meet him there. He sounded relieved, likely thinking I'd avoid embarrassment. I arrived as the party was in full swing. Women in floral prints and wide-brimmed hats sipped champagne on the manicured lawn. I stepped out of the car and walked calmly through the gate. I saw the moment Leo spotted me. His confusion was visible from across the garden. I looked different. Not richer, but assured. The woman in the thrift store cardigan was gone. I walked directly to Mrs. Thorne, who was holding court near a rose arbor. "Maya, dear, you're late," she said, her eyes quickly scanning my dress, a flicker of uncertainty in them. "And you've dressed up." "Hello, Mrs. Thorne," I said, my voice calm and clear. "The party looks lovely. My mother would adore these roses. She's designing the gardens for the new Carlton Museum wing, you know. It's been quite the project for her firm." A subtle stillness fell over the immediate group. Mrs. Thorne blinked. "Your mother?" "Yes," I said, turning to include a woman I recognized as a major donor to the arts. "Eleanor Vance. You might know her work, Mrs. Abernathy. She did the restoration of the Grand Hotel." Mrs. Abernathy's eyes lit up with genuine interest. "Eleanor Vance is your mother. My dear, she's a genius. We've been trying to get her for our foundation gala for years." The shift was instantaneous and absolute. Mrs. Thorne's face underwent a slow, painful transformation. The pity evaporated, replaced by dawning horror as she recalculated everything. The community college brochures, the thrift shop, the staff buffet note for my parents. Leo had reached us, his face pale. "Maya, what is this?" I looked at him, then at his mother. "This is the truth," I said simply. No anger, just finality. "The experiment is over." The payoff was not in words, but in the obliteration of their fantasy. They weren't shocked by wealth. They were shocked by their own colossal, recorded misjudgment, witnessed by the very peers they sought to impress. There was no dramatic scene after that. The party continued, but the axis had tilted. I stayed for perhaps 20 minutes, making polite, vague conversation with a few people who now looked at me with entirely new eyes. I then excused myself and left. The silence in the car on the way home was profound, but it was a peaceful silence. Leo came over that night. He was not angry. He was shattered. "Why didn't you tell me?" he kept asking, his voice ragged. "Why did you let me? Why did you let us?" "You never asked, Leo," I said softly. "You accepted the version of me that was easiest for your family to process. And when they tried to reshape that version into something small enough to fit in their world, you helped them. We talked for hours, but the foundation was dust. The man I loved existed in the bookstore in the rain, but he could not survive in the gilded cage of his family's expectations. He was not strong enough to defend an idea of me that challenged them. We ended it with a deep, aching sadness, but without malice. He was a casualty of the same system I had rejected. Vivian Thorne, in a stunning act of hypocrisy, called me a week later. Her voice was cloyingly sweet, a complete about-face. She'd done some research and was so delighted to discover my family's wonderful accomplishments. She invited me to a proper lunch at the club, to start anew. "Thank you, Mrs. Thorne," I said, my voice polite and final. "But I don't think that will be necessary. My life is quite full. I wish you all the best." Clicking the phone down on that conversation was one of the most satisfying moments of my life. It wasn't vindictive. It was a firm, clean boundary drawn in the sand. The true resolution was a homecoming. I had dinner with my parents and told them the whole story of the garden party. We laughed until we cried, at the absurdity of it, at the pain of it, at the sheer relief of it being over. My mother toasted to never eating at the staff buffet again. My father just hugged me extra tight. I learned that authenticity is not a weapon you wield against others, it is an armor you wear for yourself. A test of character is only valid if you bring your full character to the table. By hiding my truth, I didn't filter out the unworthy. I created a vacuum that sucked in the very people who would only value a facade. I also learned that love, real love, should feel like an expansion, not a contraction. It should make you feel more yourself, not less. I moved forward, not with a hardened heart, but with a clearer one. I introduced myself, my work, and my family with open pride. The right people, the ones who valued substance over silhouette, found their way to me. The most valuable thing you can ever be is yourself. Anyone who asks for a discount version was never going to pay the full price of your heart. If this raw life story about identity, family, and the masks we sometimes wear resonated with you, please share your thoughts in the comments. For more calm reflections on love and self-discovery, consider subscribing to Her Voices. Thank you for listening.